Hi, this is Marc Childs from Childs Davidson. Welcome to our video series on FMCG issues. Today I'm going to talk to you about category management. And in fact, my title is How Category Management Has Failed Us. Now, I'm guessing that's going to be a very controversial statement. It's become a very standard way of working for major FMCG companies around the world. It's particularly an important aspect of the way sales departments engage with major customers. Thousands of jobs are involved in doing category analysis and preparing category stories for account managers to take to major customers. So I don't for one moment question that those people are adding value and that their work is good and important and still relevant. However, I want to make two important points in relation to this. The first is making a distinction between what has commonly become called category management and what is quite separately what I call category strategy. The other big, and I'll come to that shortly, the other big point I want to make is how category management itself has evolved and where it stands right now in the process of engaging with customers. So let's start with the second of those. Some of you might not even have been around in the industry when Walmart first started working with P&G. Using P&G's expertise and far superior resources in terms of ability to analyse the marketplace to help Walmart be more effective in the categories in which P&G participated. And that was, I think, such a success that it became a Walmart way of doing business. In effect, they set out to outsource their category strategy work to nominated category captains amongst their major suppliers. In connection with that, they quite radically developed and launched Retail Link, which they gave to their category captains. Quite remarkable given that everywhere else in the world retailers sell that data. But it showed how committed they were to partnering with category captains to drive those categories. But there were a couple of other peculiarities that we don't see so much outside of the US. One is that the people assigned by manufacturers to work on Walmart categories, of course, signed confidentiality agreements, which basically meant there were Chinese walls between them and their own manufacturing companies on the strategy work they were working on. The other is that their whole focus was on helping Walmart grow its strategies. Now, part of that was that if the manufacturer's own brands were not a relevant part of growing the strategy, they were at significant risk of losing out. Now, at the time, we thought that that style of category management was going to become the norm around the world, the new way of working between manufacturers and retailers. And certainly in those days, in the 90s, in the late 90s even, retailers were still very receptive to the input from manufacturers and very keen to collaborate. So out of that work in the US grew what was widely known as the Harris model, the 7 or 8 step approach to category management that started with understanding the decision tree of the shopper. In my view, far too simplistic an approach to how the real world works, but retailers like things to be simple, and that helped the dialogue with retailers. Now, what actually happened though was that the retailers outside of the US started to adopt what was more like the Tesco model. Tesco was very good at keeping its suppliers off balance, pressing them for input, allowing them a certain amount of access but maintaining control of their category decision making. Quite different from Walmart. And so in the Western markets that did accept and adopt that kind of category management, that's the way it tended to go. By 2000 or so, most sales functions, and certainly in the 2000s, most sales functions had established a category management function. People with specialized skills in analyzing categories and building selling stories to go to the retailer with. Retailers themselves had quite well developed category management approaches that involved obviously range reviews and category management working sessions with suppliers where they received the inputs from suppliers as a basis for making their own decisions. What we've seen since then is a gradual evolution of most of those who were involved in that process towards retailers wanting to have more control and to be more sceptical of the inputs from manufacturers. I think to some extent manufacturers have themselves to blame for that. And that's because certainly most of the examples I've ever seen, the manufacturers would of course use the information on categories to support their own story, to protect and support their own brands. It's only natural they would do that. But of course that's contributed to the fact that retailer buyers receiving all of this and all these conflicting stories, quite often conflicting, that they became sceptical and became less receptive through time. And of course, as part of that, I'm not saying it's the cause, but certainly as part of that, the retailers started to get smarter at developing their own category strategies, drawing on expertise other than manufacturers and drawing on market data themselves. Now, I'm not saying they were better at it, and in fact, a lot of what they did introduced rigidities in their decision making that I think were harmful to them. And certainly excluding insights from manufacturers is quite often to their detriment. But that's the way it's evolved. I said there were two things I wanted to talk about. The other was making a distinction between big C, big M category management and what I'm calling category strategy. Now, I talked a little bit about what category management is earlier in this video, but of course most salespeople know exactly what category management is. That's the process by which they use category information to go to the retailer and support their brand proposition. Category strategy, on the other hand, is something that the marketing department should be doing before they get to brand strategy. Surely it makes sense to understand the market context of your brands before you formulate brand strategy. But how often have we seen marketing departments focused on brand strategy rather than category strategy? And I get the feeling that it's something like the old saying, if all I've got's a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So let's just take a step back. And I want to use an analogy. If I were going to go fishing on a lake, you would think that I would want to know a little bit about the lake. You'd think I'd want to know the kinds of fish there might be there and the sort of bait they like and the sort of hooks I need to catch those fish. It'd be good if I knew where the fish were in the lake, of course. And so in my analogy, the boat that I get in and the gear I'm using to go and catch fish is kind of like the brand. When I'm talking about category strategy, I mean defining the boundaries of the category that we're going after. Now that might sound like that's straightforward, but it clearly isn't. You know, if I'm Coca-Cola and I'm going for share of stomach or share of beverages, I might have a much bolder definition of the category I'm operating in with Coca-Cola than if I were a much smaller player who was just going after share of cola. And both of them would be correct. So the definition of the boundaries of a category are critically important as a first step in developing category strategy. Secondly, I'd really like to know something about choice drivers of the consumers in that category. So who are the consumers and by what principles are they making choices between brands and between competitive sets in the category? Thirdly, by examining the category and the competitive sets within it, I start to get an idea of the rules of engagement. Now, I'm not saying every brand has to copy, but we should know what the basic principles are for being in a category. I'll give you an example. From our work in beer, we know that if we wanted to be in the traditional mainstream beer category, regardless of what market we're talking about, it's going to be masculine, It's probably going to be 4.5 to 4.9% alcohol. It's going to have old traditional branding that's been around for a long time and therefore gathered some heritage, and so on and so on. So if I want to launch a beer that's, 5.5% alcohol and a bit fancy, well, I'm probably not in the mainstream traditional category. I'm somewhere else, which is fine. But if I want to be in mainstream traditional category, I have to basically follow the rules of engagement. Fourthly, in examining the category and looking at how it's evolving through time, we can get an idea of the change dynamics that are going on in the category. We can therefore get a sense of how we can get out ahead of that, and we can look at who's winning and who's losing. So we need to look at winners and losers to understand the characteristics and the dynamics that help us with future innovation. Fifthly, we can examine unmet needs. That's the white space that marketers talk about. Well, the white space comes from understanding the boundaries of our category and who the players are and where they're positioned within those boundaries. And then finally, we can use those to then develop specific brand initiatives that are relevant to that category. Now, I know that's a fairly long-winded summary of what category strategy is about, but I've dwelt on it because I want to make the distinction that it is very different from category management as practiced by category management people working with customers. And how often then have I heard category management personnel saying, we've been working on the category, we've got these insights about the category, and we try to convince the brand managers to adopt some of them, to look at some of the opportunities and the new initiatives that might be possible. And how often do they have trouble because they're catching up from behind? Because these things should have been done by marketing as part of their overall strategic development of brands. They can't be done as an afterthought by a function sitting in the sales department. They also can't be done by a separate customer marketing function. And I know that some companies have that. They'll have marketing, they'll have customer marketing, and they'll have sales. Well, it can't be done after marketing. It has to be done as part of the overall marketing strategy process. I also often hear general managers say, and this is a hangover from the old days of the category captain principle, how often have I heard GMs say, I don't want to do category management, I want to focus on making our brands win. And that's a kind of a misunderstanding, because the idea of doing category strategy is to make your brands better and stronger and more relevant to the market. Surely that's a way of making your brands grow. I don't suggest for 1 minute that category management should be about helping the retailer grow their category to the detriment of your brands. On the contrary, it should be about supporting your brands and making your brands stronger and finding innovations that make the category better. Now, given everything I've said already about the fact that category management has become such an important part of the way we do business with retailers and an important part of how retailers themselves function, why am I saying that it's failed us? Well, it's partly because it has gradually waned as a process in terms of how it's accepted by retailers themselves. But more particularly, what it's done is captured the naming of category management to the point where marketing have a tendency to believe that category management is a sales thing and something that they don't have to do. And nothing could be further from the truth. I guess I'll leave you with one final thought, and that is time for the marketing function to step up in those 50% or so of companies that are still fixated with brands rather than categories first. Marketing people need to embrace the idea of category strategy as the foundation for brand strategy, and then treating category management as a subset.